I'm Gail Robinson-Oturu. Currently, I'm a professor of voice at Austin Peay State University. I'm a singer originally from Washington, D.C., and I joined academe in 1984 at Bethune-Cookman College. The inspiration for this project, which I'll name broadly the Legacy Project, began during my days teaching at Bethune-Cookman College, now university. I encountered, that's a small liberal arts, historically black university where I encountered some of the most talented musicians that I've heard nationwide, but even worldwide. I remember having a lesson with a young tenor whom I thought had great possibilities for a career in singing. He had a wonderful voice, good musician, piano skills, facility with languages, loved audiences loved him, great sense of humor and personality. And I initiated a conversation about career, and he said, "Oh, I figured this out. I want to go back to my high school and teach." And I said, "Well, being a teacher is great." I said, "We need some more men, and we need excellent musicians as teachers." I said, "You'll bring more to your teaching if you go out and do something in the field. You can bring a lot to your teaching then." And I continued to pursue this conversation, and he tapped on the piano and he said, "Earth to Robinson." I looked at him, he said, "Did you forget I was black?" And this young man had a beautiful dark complexion. I said, "Baby, I can never forget that you're black." And he said, "Black people don't sing opera." That penetrated. I was shocked, and I haven't forgotten it at this point. Now, of course, part of my mind went to, well, what do you think I do? But I knew the problem was far more pervasive and deep than that. So I stopped and I said, "Of course they do." He said, "Well, name some." So I said, "There's Jesse Norman, there's Leontine Price, there's Marian Anderson, Kathleen Battle, and Shirley Verrett, Martina Arroyo, Leona Mitchell," and I kept naming, and he said, "Okay, I'll give you that. But you haven't named a single male." And I said, "Okay, there's, I did manage to name a few. It brought little recognition, and then I went back and said, Paul Robeson," he said, "Isn't he dead?" I said, "Okay, point well taken." It had not occurred to me. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I grew up at a time it was predominantly black. All of my teachers were black, all of my mentors. There were plenty of fine singers around. It had not occurred to me the status of the African American singer in mainstream opera. And I vowed to never be ignorant about that again and to do whatever I could do. Fast forward, I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship from the United Negro College Fund and the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, and an invitation to become a visiting scholar at Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. That was in 1992-93. I was given a sabbatical by Bethune-Cookman, and I went, and I started researching and doing as much searching. Initially, I was looking to see what commonalities there were in the African American male and females in the different generations, that the successful singers had some success. Is there a particular pattern towards success? While I was looking at the various generations, I came upon the name Todd Duncan. It's a name that I knew all my life. One of my musical mentors was a longtime student of Todd Duncan. I knew the name, but I didn't realize his contributions, the significance of his contribution. I didn't know that I knew he was the original Porgy, selected by George Gershwin in the 30s. I didn't realize that he was the first African American, male or female, to sing a leading role with a major American opera company. He sang Tonio and I Pagliacci for New York City Opera. That was 1945. As I started pulling up information here, there, nothing was comprehensively written, but I just started finding, wow, there are people who are doing things, this needs to be known. And I realized that then 1995, that means that would be 50 years that African Americans have been in the mainstream of opera in America. They've sung in other parts of the world, but in America. And I said, that should not go unnoticed. So I began to put this little pea brain of mine to work and say, well, what can I do to make this known? Thought about it. I was at Harvard, where they have symposium for this and symposium for that and symposium for the other, and they're all important. And I'm thinking, this is critical. We need a symposium for this too. So, as I normally do, I'll get feedback from trusted friends. I called my best friend Monica and said, what does this sound like? And we talked about it, and she said, you know, you should call Dr. McGinty. Dr. McGinty is my heart. She's a scholar. She's the first American to earn a PhD in musicology from Oxford, first American, black or white. I was her undergraduate assistant. I was one of her students. She hired me as a research assistant. She was my friend, my confidant. And she thinks very logically, and I bounced the idea off of her. She thought it was a great idea. She had ideas. The second person that I talked to, well, the third person, she was the second, was a colleague of mine from school, Talmadge Fauntleroy. Talmadge Fauntleroy was an opera director and had a terrible time entering the field in the United States. He was always given the reason, oh, we need you to be able to speak Italian fluently, and we need you to this. There was always some reason that he felt really wasn't the real reason. So Talmadge said, this is the last time somebody's going to tell me I can't be a director because I don't speak Italian. So he moved to Italy and he studied Italian. He started opera lirica and stayed there for 25 years. He came back and forth. He was now back in the States, and he eventually became, I think, the first director at the Met. He was on the directing staff for Porgy and Bess. But I talked to Talmadge because he's a go-getter. Talked to Dr. McGinty, she's the scholar. And we came up with, you're right there at Harvard. This is something that really, you should get a buy-in from Harvard. And I talked to the powers that be at Harvard, Randall Burkett. He was working with the fellows, visiting scholars and residents. He thought it was a great idea. Arranged for me to have a meeting with Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was the director. So, and we called him Skip. So I had a meeting with Skip, and he thought it was a brilliant idea. He said, well, we are doing a lot with music, with other genres of music. But we really have not done a lot of research on the classical African American artist. And he thought it was a wonderful thing. He said, we're good at bringing in money, but we would need your help in planning this. So again, I go back to my advisors and just try to brainstorm who would be the people. Dr. McGinty, she said, you need a face for this. And we came up with the name George Shirley. Of course, I had found him in my research. He had been quoted on numerous articles, been interviewed in the literature. He was the first African American tenor at the Metropolitan Opera. He was now at the University of Michigan as a distinguished professor, the Joseph E. Matty distinguished professor, an endowed chair. And I thought, that sounds great. So I was given his number, and I think I had his number from one other time in the process of doing this research. But I was never comfortable calling George Shirley. Like, he didn't know me from a hole in the head. And so eventually I got the nerve to call him, and he took the call, and I nearly passed out. It's like, oh my God, I'm talking to George Shirley. He answered this phone call, you know, who am I? And he was gracious. And he was gracious. I was petrified, but he was gracious. And he agreed to be an honorary chair. I remember talking to Talmadge, and he said, you're going to need also somebody who is in New York, because George is no longer in New York. You need somebody who knows the singers and who's there, and somebody also who has a history. And we came up with Betty Allen. She's at the Harlem School, and she's in New York. She's not actively singing, but she knows who's out there. We called Betty Allen. They both agreed. So I went back to Skip, and he agreed that Harvard would host a meeting and invite some key people to plan whatever it is. Skip wanted anybody who was anybody, and everybody who was something to be included. He didn't want anybody to be left out. And then this began to feel like, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into? I don't know all these people, and how do we get everybody who's anybody into this event? And then I'm thinking, this is beginning to feel like an event where you have something, everybody says, this was great, and then you go home. And I wanted something that had a lasting impact. We had about 12 to 15 people actually come to Harvard. 2 were funded by Harvard, Betty Allen and George Shirley. The others came on their own. I'm eternally grateful. Dr. McGinty was one, Talmadge Fauntleroy was another. I called R.J. Murray, who was the president of National Opera Association. He was unable to come, but he said, this sounds great. Please represent, since I was a member and on the board at that time, please represent NOA. Let me know what you would like for us to do. We invited Jan Del Sesto, who was in Boston, and I think she was the artistic director or general director of the Boston Lyric Opera. I had Linda Jackson. She was with Chautauqua. We had Skip wanted me to make sure that Anthony Davis, who was a visiting scholar or lecturer at Harvard, composer, was there. We had Tomas Hernandez from the National Endowment for the Arts. We had a representative from the Boston Arts Council. I'm missing a few people, but it was an elite group around the table. And we had one day to figure out what were we going to do. So I remember brainstorming, and poor Dr. McGinty, she got so many calls from me. And I'm thinking, well, how do you handle, all these big people here? And she said, just make sure that your whole meeting isn't taken up by saying who they are. Figure out what you're going to do. So I decided that when we all met, we were going to introduce folks in 25 words or less. So I began the meeting, and George and Betty and I had a long conversation, and they were very comfortable with me facilitating the meeting. Skip sent us a note and said he had to be out of the country, but it was important, and we had his blessings. So when we had the meeting, I greeted everybody and I said, well, you're each here because of your importance and significance in the field. And if I try to say how important you are, we will take the whole day. So I would like for us to know who's at the table, but if you can tell me your importance in 25 words or less, I think we'll make some progress. So everybody, I said, can we start to my left with singer, first African American to sing at the Met, George Shirley, distinguished professor George Shirley. He said, I'm here. And then the next person. So everybody complied, and we got through everybody. It's like, woo, okay, we got through that. We had a very fertile meeting. I think that's the way to say it. Very fertile meeting. I said, why don't we begin? I like for us to do the who, what, when, where, and how, but let's start off with why we are here. This is what I see as the area of need and difficulty. May we spend the first so many, I don't know how many minutes I allocated for it, to discuss our reason why. I stated, I think George and Betty and I had kind of come to a meeting of the minds as what we, the three of us, thought they were. And I said, this is what I think they are. Can we go around the table? And I was surprised as to how many, everybody had their own passion for some version of that. I said, we'll start with why. Then we would like to say what can be done or what needs to be done to address this. We won't go into whether or not if we can or how or when and blah, 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 blah. I said that will be later this afternoon. But we need to know what can be done. And once we figure that out, then we will have a break and we'll come back after we eat and decide which of this what can be done we can do and how. So it was a very directed meeting, and people complied. There were many moments where people got a little passionate. Well, how can we do this? And somebody said, that's how. We on what? So we got through a whole list. By the end of that meeting, we had a list of what we wanted, when we wanted it, how it could happen. We had identified 4 broad purposes. We wanted to commemorate the past. We felt that there was too little known history. We wanted to analyze what the present status was. We wanted to draw attention to the paucity of persons in the field, and we wanted to promote the future. We felt those 4 things. We felt that it would be wonderful to have a performance, but we felt it was also important that we have some type of discourse, some scholarship to learn from this. So initially, when the sky was the limit, we decided, I think it was September 14th, should have looked that up. It was whenever Todd Duncan made his debut, we would have a big performance at Carnegie Hall, or possibly Lincoln Center was also mentioned in the whole thing. Carnegie Hall was actually available whatever day we had said we wanted it. And they penciled it in, but of course we didn't have any money at that time. But they penciled it in. And then George was saying, you know, this is such a rich, Harvard is such a scholarly place. It deserves the attention here. Let's have some type of a symposium here on campus or in Boston. Then the question is, well, who's going to come? And I thought it was that here we are doing this major project, but we don't have a ready-made audience. So I said, well, National Opera Association, I wonder if National Opera Association would pay tribute to this cause on its convention. We're 2 years out. I don't think that they have designated a place. Maybe if their convention could be in Boston, and if we can have the symposium in conjunction or collaboration with National Opera Association, that's an educational organization. They thought it was a good idea. National Opera Association thought it was a good idea. And things unfolded. Not to drag the story on, I would just say that the monies that we were anticipating being able to pull in to underwrite this huge event did not materialize for whatever reason. National Opera Association said, we have enough buy-in for us to do this without it. And so that gave birth to the Legacy Project. And we called it the Golden Anniversary, 50 years of African Americans in the mainstream of opera in America. And we held it at the Royal Sonesta Hotel in Boston, 1995. You asked me about challenges. There were a few tenuous moments, challenges, unexpected moments, and the biggest had to do with expected funding that did not materialize. I received a fax maybe 7 months before the conference, but certainly well after people were excited about the idea and had planned to come. I received a letter that the funding that we were expecting would not come through for whatever reasons. I could hardly process that. And I happened to have received that notification on the same day that my dean announced to the president of the university, the vice president of academic affairs / dean of the faculty, and the whole humanities division faculty that we were going to Boston, and put me on the spot to tell everyone why we were going. Well, of course, I didn't know if we could go because the funding that had been promised did not materialize. So calling Bob Hansen, letting him know of the news, I can't be more grateful, because he believed in the project. He thought it was just important for NOA to still carry forth this important historic event, and he did. I called George Shirley. He shared the same mindset. He said, if Bob Hansen says we can do it, let's go with it. It was just that important. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, George. I'm eternally grateful. There were several important people who helped facilitate this program outside of Bob Hansen as the president of NOA, the two co-chairs, Betty Allen and George Shirley, and myself as coordinator. One, I pressed my two student workers into service, Cicely Jackson and Frederick Ingram, who was an instrumental music education major from inner city Miami and wrote the most astounding thank you letter saying he never imagined sitting up half the night listening and enjoying Mozart, Verdi, Puccini, and Bizet. Very grateful. I also pressed every friend I had into service, but especially DeVarius Curry, an attorney in Washington, D.C., another geographical challenge. But she was the one who secured the letter from the White House. She secured the proclamation from the Massachusetts governor, William Weld, at that time. She took over coordination of the gala banquet, some logistical matters. She helped us at 4 a.m. in the morning when we realized that there was an error in the boxes of programs that were shipped to us. And we both agreed, there's no way we can let this program go. Her standards were as high as everybody's. There's no way. So we stayed up until 4 in the morning and redid the programs and then had to send it out for reprinting. There are just so many people who worked. Elvira Green, who was interviewed, but who came over. She, as fabulous as her singing is, she wasn't on the program, but she stayed there and kept that music going, turning pages, and just kept the evening going and going and going. Never complained, just gracious to help the cause. So many people believed in the cause, and I'm grateful that we were able to have it materialize and come to fruition.